So, dear colleagues and students and visitors of the Faces of Science Park 2022 event, a warm welcome to all of you who are watching right now in real time, or perhaps later watching the video, which will be made available online. My name is Michiel Keestra, as the Faculty Diversity Officer of the Faculty of Science of the University of Amsterdam. I'm really very pleased to host this session and to welcome our panelists, which I will introduce in a moment, and also to welcome our faculty dean, Peter van Tienderen, who will share a couple of words of welcome to all of us. Peter, I will unshare the slides so we can see more of you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michiel, and welcome everybody on this wonderful meeting. A special thanks, of course, to Michiel because he's leaving us as the faculty diversity officer to become the diversity officer of the entire university. So your task will even be more challenging in the future, Michiel, than it already was. And I think I will share everyone's opinion that we are very grateful of what you've done, and this is one example of that. And also to all panelists, I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. A first few personal words, I think, is also useful, because what you are and what you intend comes from your background and how you feel about issues like this. So I just made a note before I came to this meeting yesterday. Well, what should I say? And what is inspiration for me on a personal touch? And I immediately came to my mind to a program that I saw recently. That is maybe something that you do not expect from me, but it was a collaboration between a musician and a fantastic percussionist player, Dominique Fleischhauer, and Redo. Maybe some of you have heard Redo. So his real name is Redouan Aïchit, and he is a breakdancer. They make programs together, and I do a little advertisement. I think in a couple of months they will continue with their shows in the country. And it's fantastic what they do together, the breakdancing as well as the music. And what you don't notice when you see it, please go ahead and look at YouTube to see one of his movies. And then you don't notice that he is handicapped. So he has quite a severe handicap in his body. Nevertheless, his motto is no excuses, no limits. So just be who you are and try to do everything what you can to do that. And that's, I think, a wonderful message for all of us. I believe you also have made a TEDx presentation, which is also very impressive. So a few recommendations to you all, and it's a very inspirational topic for me. Another thing that I would like to mention is a meeting we had recently with people from the faculty, and I asked them, what do you do together with Africa? It's pleasing that you are here, Christian, as well, because we do a lot more than I thought there were. So a lot of people were working on working together, especially working together with young children, students, to see what we can do together and how we can change perhaps the future, which is a big ambition, of course, but it always starts with educating young people. And Diletta is here as well, and I'm also very enthusiastic about the things that she did with young children in mathematics in Africa. And there were lots of topics, and we're now discussing what can we do more and how can we use that energy that was there to do useful things. That can be mentorships of students, or it can be courses or invitations, or lots of opportunities that we would like to do in the future. So that's also very inspirational for me. And the last thing, and I want to end with that, is also a worry, and that's also the topic of today's panel meeting, I think, and that's about polarization in society and also around science. And in Corona times, that has made it more extreme. So the positions that people take have become more extreme. They are not open often for discussions. They have their own channels in which they get their information, and they are reinforced by the things that they think and already feel. So the open discussion is gone. And that is, I think, something that is of a great concern to all of us. So science is under threat. We also need to protect it. I think that we can discuss with each other what science is. Also discuss dissenting opinions, because we know that there are a lot of people that have other opinions that we may not approve, but nevertheless, we cannot ignore it. We have to stay in contact and stay in discussion with that. That holds for our internal community as a science faculty and as a university, because we are in a privileged position, of course, that we have the time to think about these things, and we also, and that comes with a responsibility also to contribute something to the outside world. That is at least my opinion. And hopefully that will result to more understanding of each other, and that we feel free to express ourselves in our opinions, and also look forward and see how we solve the important problems that are ahead of us. So with that, I would like to end. Michiel, I give the floor back to you, and I hope and I assume that it will be a very, very interesting discussion. And I may not be here all the time, but I certainly will have a look at the recording later to see what comes out of it. So thank you all again.
Well, thanks a lot for your kind words, Peter, and also for the both the inspirational and also the encouraging words. I do indeed think that we will talk about some of the issues that you mentioned. I know in the faculty strategic plan on your behalf also there's this a topic of restoring or increasing public trust in science, that from our Science Park community we also have a kind of a duty to interact, engage with the wider community, Amsterdam community. And I think later in this panel we also discuss like what are the responsibilities that we as scientists have beyond the confines of our department. So thanks really for encouraging that conversation. Good. For now, what I will do is, and I'm using some slides for that, I'm going to introduce our three panelists successively. And then we have a set of questions prepared with the panelists and that will be discussed. And for each question, there will be also a question period where audience members are really invited to ask questions. So I have some comments to which we will respond as a panel. But let me again share the screen. So this is the panel discussion is on science in time of a crisis, from vaccines to restoring public trust, which is what Peter van Tielen just also mentioned as a really an important concern for us as scientists. I just want to give a very brief shout out to all the colleagues with whom we are collaborating as a faculty diversity office over the years, I should say, and also for this current Faces of Science Park event. So there are many students and staff members involved in Diversity Sounding Board. We've got now almost all research institutes having their own diversity and inclusion committees, and we're working with the educational institutes to do likewise. So that's really great, because lots of what is happening at local institutional level regarding diversity and inclusion can be really taken up by these local committees. This is the program for the entire week. So we are now here at Tuesday. So as you can see for today also, there's a full program after this panel session, which lasts until 2 o'clock. There will be an informal like lunch break before we'll have an online information market. So you can just go online and find the link for the information market as well. And then also I'd like to acknowledge that we are working together with many colleagues and students from the faculty and beyond, including the panelists, to prepare the Faces of Science Park event. So many, many thanks to all of you. It's needless to say, but indeed without all your ideas and efforts, we wouldn't be able to put together this exciting program. All right, then gradually let's get to the topic of today. I think all of us are very much aware how the COVID-19 crisis have really affected everything that we do, from our very private family lives, our private health, to professional life, work, study, etc. And indeed, from our Faculty Diversity Office, we've also been involved very soon after the start of the pandemic in March 2020 to offer a first like memo, a kind of set of warnings regarding the impact of the measures, the lockdown measures, the online teaching, etc., the impact that this would have on the equity, diversity, and inclusion of our students and faculty. And I don't need to expand on that, because I think all of us have by now some shared knowledge of how this affects our family lives. I know several of you who are present are having kids around, which is one indication of the fact that working in science in crisis, in times of crisis, is not as it used to be. And of course, the panel for today is addressing the question, so how do we get back to a normal situation? The new normal, will we take along lessons from what we've learned before? And indeed, in last December, together with our working group, Disabilities and Chronic Disorders, we published and disseminated at the university 8 lessons that we've drawn from the pandemic. Because not everything is only a downside. Being online for people with disabilities and chronic disorders can really have also benefits. It's easier, you don't need to transport, you might combine like doctor's appointments more easily with your work schedule in an online environment and elsewhere. So there are also some benefits. So we should be really careful in returning, hopefully maybe after the summer, to a new normal and taking along lessons that we as scientists have learned on how we operate as scientists. So that is what today's panel is about. I'm going to introduce the 3 panelists to you. First, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Carmen Antonsch, who is zooming in all the way from the University of Twente, which is in the east of the Netherlands. Carmen is Assistant Professor of GeoHealth, is working on the intersection between security, water, and health in international collaborations, has done consultations also for many international bodies, including the WHO and UNICEF. And we are very happy that she's here to share her ideas on the questions that we will present in a moment. And Carmen, I asked you as much as the other panelists to share with us a bit on how the pandemic has affected your work. How was your trajectory really pushed in a different direction due to the corona pandemic? And I'm going to pull up the slide that you yourself suggested, prepared. So maybe you can inform us a bit on what is happening in your academic life.
Thank you so much, Makiel, and very nice to be part of this panel. Thanks very much. I believe you can all hear and see me very well, I hope.
We can hear you well. I don't think I can see you at this point, but that may be due to the small gallery of pictures. Maybe later you'll have a better view.
Okay, good. Okay, so thanks. As Makiel already pointed out, I work in GeoHealth and medical geography, and what we do really is we investigate the connections between people, their health, their changing physical and social environments, and work in a very multi and interdisciplinary way. We look at public health, social science, geography, GI science, and other perspectives. And my personal focus area is on water security and global health in space and time. I look at health risks and water-related infectious disease exposure, assessment, and prevention, specifically at drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene, what we abbreviate as WASH. You can see this in this graph. At health risk perceptions, behaviors, risk communication, and at how to use this data to inform decision-making. COVID-19 is an infectious disease which affects every aspect of our lives and societies. And with the risk to this disease to be potentially reduced by improved wash, drinking water, sanitation, hygiene. This fits right into our research area and has certainly drawn an increased focus on geohealth, as well as on the need to integrate policy with science as well. So what we have seen over the past 2 years was a substantially greater interest in our work from researchers, from practitioners, from policymakers globally, for research and for capacity building projects as well. In the slide here, the projects marked in red are the new ones that we started since the pandemic started. So we extended our previous wash in household, schools, and healthcare facility work to include the implications for the occurrence of COVID-19, for example, in Latin America. Some of these projects we implement with a partner that is new to us. That's the World Bank. We also have new projects since the start of the pandemic in Europe and the Netherlands, where we extend our risk perception and behavior research to pandemics. For example, by looking at governmental decision-making for preventative health measures. That is the case study from the Netherlands as well. We also use spatial-temporal analysis to look at how COVID-19 spreads and how, for example, coronavirus in wastewater and different other COVID-19 related epidemiological indicators are associated with space and time, and use here data from the RIBM to make meaningful recommendations on improved public health planning. So our work was heavily affected, I would say, and we were able to extend our work because COVID is one of our, it's a good example for geohealth. Let's put it this way. Thank you.
Right, that's quite an impressive set of changes or new projects due to the pandemic. I think we'll hear that from Marie and Christian likewise. It's also reminding me of, and we may talk about that somewhat later, how typically scientific projects take quite a while to start off after proposals, funding, etc., and how maybe the corona pandemic has shown that there's a different way of working possible. And it's intriguing to see in this slide how that has worked out in your case. Many thanks, Carmen.
Yeah.
So the next guest is Professor Christian Happy. Zooming in all the way from Nigeria, from Redeemers University in Nigeria, where Christian is professor of molecular biology and genomics, but also heading the African Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Diseases. And also Professor Happy has been quite present in several conversations, public conversations, advocating, asking for an African vaccine. So since we don't have a slide, I think let's have this smaller look. So maybe Christian, if I may, can you share with us how the pandemic has changed your work over the last couple of years? I think you're still muted.
Yeah, thank you, and then thank you, and then for the invitation, and then I also want to thank my co-panelists, to find the time to come in this period where we really have been bogged down with so much going on. And it is a pleasure to be here, and then also to say that COVID really has disrupted, I would say, activities in my lab. By way of introduction, the Africa Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Diseases that I'm the director is WHO and the Africa CDC reference laboratory on the continent for infectious disease genomics and research innovation. But prior to COVID, so we were working on a very new project, an innovative project called Sentinel. Sentinel was a project actually stated to create an early warning system for pandemic prevention and response. And as we were developing that, then COVID struck and really, had to change the trajectory of all our efforts. So my whole lab and my own research for the past 2 years have been focused just around COVID. Simply because we have the responsibility, to work and provide evidence to governments, not only in Nigeria, but across Africa. And in so doing, so we really swung into action immediately and started working with the local, national government, and then also the global health community And that's the reason why, for instance, the first COVID genome sequence in Africa was done in a lab, because we really had that responsibility. But we were working around the clock, and then that's the reason why we were able to sequence that genome on an unprecedented speed, 48 hours, and then make the data available to the global health community. So since then, I can tell you that we have done nothing else but to work on COVID, because we have the responsibility to support the local government, the national government, and then also to support the Pan-African organization like the African Union. So through this process, we just not only have to research, but we also have to think about developing countermeasures. We develop new vaccines and then also new diagnostics, and then try to make this available, even though at some point, for vaccines now, it was stalled because there was no resources to move it beyond for clinical trial. But we've also been able to use the COVID, to train a good mass of young African scientists. In the past 2 years, we've trained, scientists from about 32 African countries in doing, genome sequence, and then also use information to help public health response. And we've also supported, many African governments, over about 30 African governments, to sequence their COVID-19 samples and make the data actionable back to them, and then they use such information to guide their policy or public health response. So in a way, it's been quite a busy period for us, because we didn't anticipate to be this busy. But eventually we ended up being super busy, and really we experience in my lab right now what I call fatigue, because people have been working nonstop for the past 2 years, and we get into a point where people are really, really tired. So really, COVID has really kept us on our toes and has completely stopped every other thing that we were doing in this lab. And we used to work on diseases like HIV, malaria, Lassa fever, and other viruses. But all of that came to stop, and then we're basically just starting now to start focusing on those, all because of COVID.
Thanks a lot for your story. So I think just to recap, I think what you mentioned is really that the entire lab has changed its course on the Corona track, leaving all the work that you've done on the other, like Ebola, HIV, etc., aside. And also, I think what is really interesting is what you mentioned, how your lab and your work is really central to more Pan-African initiatives and policies, which makes the responsibility of you and your colleagues, of course, even greater. And I think it's really interesting to hear somewhat later in the conversation how you think about then returning to the new normal, what that will implicate, because if I understand you correctly, it's been really a drastic change, of course. And can that really be returned to something new, something normal? I think we'll all be fascinated in hearing more about that. Thank you so much, Christian Happy. So I think for the final introduction, I will pull up the slides again in order to introduce our third panelist, Professor Marie Rosenkrantz-Lindegaard, who is from the University of Amsterdam, was last year appointed as Professor of Dynamics of Crime and Violence, and is combining her appointment with her position at the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement. And as exciting as that research already was, her work has also drastically changed due to the pandemic. And I'm really happy to share your slides. And Marie, maybe you can walk us through what we're seeing here.
Yeah, thanks, Michiel. I think you need to change the slide. I don't know. Oh, there's another slide on the screen now then.
Oh, right. That's strange. In my screen, it says it has the.
It's another screen. Oh.
Let me see. Then maybe this one. Is this better?
Oh, that's the one with my name, but then there's the one about my study as well. Yes, that's it.
Okay, at least
perfect.
Perfect. Thanks.
So thanks a lot, Michiel, and also Diletta for inviting me to this panel. It's a wonderful opportunity to actually reflect a little bit on what has been happening the last few years. I very much share Christian's notes already on being fatigued, and also kept thinking, when are we going to go back to normal? When are we going to do the usual business that we tend to do as researchers? And yeah, but it somehow seems to continue. So I think if I reflect on the last few years of research for me and also for my group, because it involves quite some people in the meantime, I think the content of what we have been doing has really changed. The methodology and also the number of collaborators, but also just the type of collaborators changed a lot. So before the COVID pandemic started, what we were studying was public space behavior and rule breaking in public space. So we were particularly interested in crime and violence, and how do people respond to situations where there's violence happening. We used video recordings from public cameras to study how people behave in these kinds of situations. And one question that for me was really interesting, of course, when the pandemic started, we could see from one moment to the other in the Netherlands that the rules and the public space behavior was changing overnight. And I was incredibly fascinated by this, walking around thinking, we must be able to use this somehow for our research, because this is like a natural experiment in some way. Now there's a complete different kind of threat. So not the type of threat that we normally see in conflict situations where people might feel afraid of violence. But now there's this more abstract threat of getting an infection from something that we don't really know yet what it's about. So one thing that we knew from the violence studies was that bystanders played a key role in intervening when there was a threat. And now I was really curious, are they going to do that if people are not keeping distance? Because we were all supposed to keep 1.5 meter distance. And what would happen if people didn't do that? Would there be an intervener, also intervening in this another kind of threat? So that was my first question, really. And that changed. So I started collecting footage from the police department that I had been working with for a long time. And then we started studying, different kinds of rule compliance with the new COVID-19 measures. So first we did a study of social distancing directives, and we set up a whole monitor based on video observations of whether people were keeping distance in Amsterdam. We did a study of mandatory mask wearing. That was a kind of experiment that was installed 1.5 years ago in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. So we studied that, whether people complied with that. And then we did a study of the installment of the night curfew. So there was a curfew installed a year ago, where people were not allowed to go outside in the evening. So what we started doing was basically studying different kinds of rule breaking and compliance. But quite a different type of topic, of course. And then in terms of methodology, I already said, so we used to do manual coding from the video observations that we did. And that was mainly observational studies. And then we actually, during the pandemic, started doing quite a lot of experiments, more natural experiments, where we looked at, okay, so the period before something was installed, a measurement, how did the compliance look like compared to when it was installed? So we were able to do that. And then we started developing automatic video coding. So, and we did that with people from Science Park, from the Natural Science Department. So basically, instead of measuring distancing just from the human coding, we developed an algorithm that could measure this for us. And that enabled us, instead of maybe studying 100 people, we were able to study 40,000 people. So this was really methodologically quite an exciting time for us. And then just to mention the last part, the collaborators. So we worked with the police department in Amsterdam for a long time. And now during the COVID, we got assignments from the Municipality of Amsterdam, from the RIVM, the Public Health Department, from the Amsterdam Safety Region. We advised the OMT and the Dutch government. So we got all these assignments to actually start studying this. And why did we get that? Because most of the social human behavioral studies that were done in the pandemic were based on self-report, which turned out to be very unreliable, because people were basically reporting the same compliance throughout the whole pandemic, more or less no changes over time. And with the videos, we could see a lot of differences from the different waves and the different periods of the pandemic. So that was, so we had a kind of a way of measuring behavior that was more reliable, and that was very useful for for policymakers. So yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for sharing that. I think it shows that not only the contents of your research, but really also the methodologies, as you mentioned, really changed a lot of collaboration. So in a way, offering a kind of a new test environment compared to pre-pandemic. I guess the fact that restaurants and theaters were closed was very helpful for you to be able to spend your time on all of this. Okay, well, thanks for these introductions to our panelists. So I'm going to unshare in a moment, but not after showing to everyone the first question. So as mentioned, I've sent 4 questions to the panelists. We'll also have a presentation in between before the 4th question. And the first question, to which I will first ask the panelists to briefly respond to it, and then afterwards ask the listeners, the audience also to participate, maybe raising issues or questions. The first question is, what is the main unexpected discovery you have made in these 2 years about how science in times of crisis operates? So the main unexpected discovery about how science in times of crisis operates. And maybe, Christian, can I ask you first to respond to this question?
Yeah, I made several discoveries, and I will start with really locally, how science in times of crisis operate. Is the fact that I discovered, around me, that many young people in our setup were more than willing, to put their head on the line just for the purpose of saving their countries. I saw a high turnover of young people that wanted to come and help with testing, diagnostics, and sequencing in my lab. And these were all students. So I think for me, that was very powerful moment, where you could see people really, instead of running away and going to hide because of a virus that they didn't know, but they rather were coming forward to actually to work and then try to confront this virus. That was at local level and in my university. But I also think that at the institutional level, I also saw that we really, it affected, the way we were doing science, because we're not prepared to work in this kind of environment generally. So, and many labs, which were not in the front line, like my own lab, had to close down. So again, we need to rethink about rethinking how we should be able to function in case we have an outbreak of this nature in the future. How do we, you can see right at the beginning, there was just so much chaos that, everything almost came up to do. So that was another situation whereby I couldn't believe that, you could have a whole institution shut down without mechanisms, at this end, to survive in a situation of pandemic with all of the restrictions and the rules that were set up. Now,
thanks.
Yeah.
So I think you're maybe there's a third point you want to make, but then maybe I'll continue. But maybe one more.
Yeah, and also, I think at the international level, I saw a lot of cooperation, especially for us working in the field of genomics and others. Really, the very big surprise was for me was how scientists were cooperating, sharing data. Sharing data in GISA, for instance, depositing data. The rate at which this information was shared were really, really impressive. That for me was a major, major discovery, to see that happening. But on the contrary, you could see governments actually, and then big farmers behaving the opposite. that is basically using the data available in data to develop countermeasures and not being able to share. So that again was an eye-opener for me, because I never expected, government to behave that way, especially being part of CEPI, where we actually set up something like a mechanism like COVAX right at the beginning, but really seeing government going in the opposite direction when we started seeing, vaccine or drug or what test nationalism arising. This for me were actually very, these were negative discoveries as well.
Hmm. Well, thanks. That's a very mixed picture, right? From students really being helping out and being enthusiastic and motivated to really work 24/7, and then the disappointments at the governmental and industry level. We'll certainly get back to that later as well. So maybe, Marie, I think some of what Christian just mentioned may be something that you can relate to as well. So what did you perceive in science in times of crisis?
Well, indeed, the speeding up of the open science principles, that's definitely something I could recognize, but also attention related to that, because I think with a lot of the studies that we did preprints, right, to publish, and then we tried to set up, so basically realizing that the structure that we have for publication is too slow and not working well in times of crisis. So when we were publishing stuff, we tried to install a kind of internal review board that could read our publications in one day, half a day, so we could actually deliver advice based on the results to the government. But that was necessary because, we had one study was just published now, and that was based on a study we did 1.5 years ago. So if we would have waited, we wouldn't have been able to provide any information, So that whole process was really going too slow. Then I think what for me personally in the field was really depressing was to realize how little we actually know about human behavior in public space. So in many ways, you would think, social science, behavioral science, we worked on this. That's what we're supposed to know about. And then when it came down to questions, very basic questions of how do people move through a public space? How do they queue up? What is the normal? We missed a baseline. We missed baseline for what is normal behavior? We don't know. We know a lot about behavior from lab settings, because psychologists are usually conducting their studies in laboratories, but we don't know anything about real life behavior. So we, of course, know it from more qualitative studies, but really systematic, structured information about what is the baseline, what is the normal behavior. We missed that. And so in some way, very depressing to realize that, as a behavioral scientist. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that it makes you somewhat humble to make that awareness. So maybe later we can hear more whether the new experiment over the past 2 years have really also led to new ideas for when we are returning to the new normal, to perhaps test out in normal situations if those ever occur. But before going there, Carmen, how about you? What did you learn about science in crisis, how it operates?
Thank you. So I think what the pandemic has taught us about what is needed is definitely collaborations, also echoing here what Marie said. Going for more multi and interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral and also science policy collaborations, and the need to connect more and reach out more to practitioners to address the crisis together. That's one. In terms of research, I think we learned that contingency planning is vital to bridge unexpected dry spills in terms of field research, for example, for our students, for empirical data collection, for example, through improved and more strategic collaborations that we have already mentioned, or sharing data, as Christian commented or mentioned. Probably also better using or making improved use of already existing data, as well as literature. Also linking here to Marie's comment about baseline data gap. In terms of science in collaboration with the Global South, I think what we have learned is that we need to put more emphasis on removing barriers to participate, for example, by moving education and research more online, removing paywalls for scientific articles and online conferences as well, simplifying, I guess, complicated scientific language as well, and also improved science communication in terms of, for example, through online blogs or just in general accessible information overall besides scientific journals. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think so. Maybe you want to respond to each other. And one issue that I think returns in all your three comments is how you've learned to improvise, and that this improvisation also means really breaking down barriers, the inherent slowness and some maybe even conservatism that is part of science, but that has been put aside. So is that indeed something that you think well would work well in other situations as well, or are you fearing that maybe these old like learned habits will kick in immediately? So how is improvisation something that we feel familiar with or naturally inclined to?
I think it has also caused a lot of anxiety, you know, in my group when I look at it. So the improvisation is, of course, has indeed been necessary, but it has also caused tensions within institutions. Because, for instance, when we were, you know, publishing and our work, you know, on well, a lot of colleagues were very anxious about, you know, because we had an internal review board. That was something we came up with. But of course, you don't follow the usual procedures for how we check, you know, for the peer reviews of our work. So how do we make sure that we are not compromising on the quality? And particularly when you are publishing stuff that you can see has a direct impact on policy, which is of course amazing as a scientist, but it's also very anxiety provoking, right? Because you see that the stakes are high and there are people that have to take responsibility for what's going on. And then, you know, so it creates anxiety, I think, as well. So I hope that we can find, yeah.
So maybe, Christian, is that something that you can respond to this tension between maybe the care that we as scientists want to have about our data, our subjects, our advice, on the other hand, the speed that we needed to do and the anxiety that is a result of that? How did you cope with that, Christian?
I mean, I don't think that it's something that we all, I think Marie just probably attended to it. It's been very challenging. At times you have information, you want it out there, but then it has to go through a process. And you worry, you know, that process will eventually have a negative impact. Because also remember that during a pandemic or during an epidemic, there are two things that are very important. First is speed and then accuracy. Those two things, you know, the speed and the accuracy of information are very critical in order to help mitigating, this epidemic. And we really felt that because we were generating data, but you know, you also need to go through a process. For some reason, you know, your institution or the government does not want to release the data at the speed at which you want it to release, even though it's been reviewed internally. I think you have to deal with it. All of us have to deal with that as researchers, you know, and it's really something that maybe moving forward, it has to be looked upon, because at least we need to set priorities. What is most important? Is it the information is accurate, but we need to release it. And there's also this whole challenge of the fact that if you also open the bands, then every garbage could be out there. I think it's really, you know, a very difficult thing to find a balance. But I think as a community, we need to really rethink, you know, this process and then probably come up with a way that will make things a little bit more flexible and then more balanced.
Right, yeah. So I think it is, as you mentioned, like this balance between speed and accuracy is something that maybe we all have to learn to either readjust or to be more flexible in navigating. And then we'll return also when later we'll talk about restoring public trust, because it may be that this balance has caused some distrust or suspicion in the eyes of the wider audience. But let's hear first, Carmen, a quick response to this need for improvisation and the kind of anxieties or insecurity that it caused.
I think so. I'm supporting what my colleagues are saying too. I think as I said, we work on geohealth. We look at medical geography. We look at how diseases and how health systems are set up in space and time. And what we can see from the amount of publications that came out related to COVID-19, even not only our own research and how we communicate it to the public can create anxiety amongst us, but also how we use information that others share. We see so much information that is being published, and it's very difficult also for us to make a quality control and to understand what is useful, what is good, and what is useful information and what isn't. So definitely for us, this was also a challenge. And looking at the work that we do, so what we do is we try to visualize and also represent in space and time how the pandemic, for example, has been affecting humans, how the disease has been spreading. So even for us, I mean, it's very, how can I say it? It is very tricky to move fast and to be able to provide the quality needed. So yeah, for us, this definitely also is a challenge.
Yeah. Thanks. So that's really the shared experience of all of you. Let's see if someone maybe from the audience is sharing that same experience or wants to know more. So please raise your hand or start asking a question, or you can write in the chat if there's anything you'd like to hear more about on this conversation on science in times of crisis. What have we learned? What unexpected lesson did it raise? And if not everyone present will be at the same front line as our panelists, so I can imagine not everyone has the same experience here. So maybe we'll continue with the next question. Let me pull up briefly my slide just to make it visible. Is this the correct slide with the first question? And then the next question really relates to what we already discussed a bit and what was also raised by Dean Peter van Tienderen, because it's about the resistant distrust and suspicion that we as scientists, or science in general, has really also raised in a wider audience. So the question is, due to its role in explaining and mitigating the crisis, science has faced more resistance, more distrust and suspicion than in normal times. How have you experienced this, and what is your response to this? So this is a question again to our panelists, and please, if anyone in the audience wants to chime in, just raise your hand or write your comment in the chat, and I'll try to include that in a conversation. But maybe first, this is something to ask our panelists. So Marie, I know we exchanged some emails in preparing the panel, and I think you had a somewhat different experience here as well. So can you share us how you respond to this question about distrust against science?
Yeah, so I think that my main experience related to this is really the pressure that I experienced, from having or wanting to deliver, solid results, and that has a lot of had relatively some impact.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my response to that pressure that I experienced, quite some of the topics that we studied were pretty controversial throughout the pandemic. It sounds strange, but it was, the face mask was a very controversial question in the Netherlands. And also the curfew caused quite a lot of unrest, or literally riots in a lot of different cities. So these topics were very loaded. So there were people that were pro and there were people that were against. And then when you deliver what we try to do, relatively objective measures of behavior here, you're often challenging public opinions, right? So there was also on the distancing, for instance, a continuous finding that we had was that people were quite well in keeping distance when they had the opportunity to do so. And the moral panic in the country in general was that nobody did it and nobody were interested and people were just focusing on their individual interests. But we didn't see that at all from the video recording. So it was so there was a lot of tension around it. So I think what our response to that was to try to be, not to take side. Even I was often asked, what is your opinion about this? I refused to give any opinions about it. And then try to really be as objective as possible and very transparent in how we were conducting the studies. So the transparency was very important, I think. I could give one example of it, for when we did the face mask evaluation, the OMT had been against the use of face mask in public space for quite a while. So the government was, against it. And then there was the mayor of Amsterdam and Rotterdam that decided to actually install it, as obligatory in public space. So there was quite some political tension there of mayors, going against the government. And then we had to do an evaluation of this on the behavioral effect of face masks. And I had someone from the RIVM on my advisory board in that study period. And I immediately sensed that tension because the RIVM was seen as against face masks. So at some point I had to put out or take out that person on the advisory board because I couldn't risk, that people would think that our results would be influenced by that political influence. So that's just an example of how these, that you have to balance these interests and have to figure out, how to, try to remain objective in conducting these studies.
Not being drawn into these partisan battles that you already mentioned. Yeah. Thanks. That gave us an interesting look behind the scenes of our outbreak management team and other advisory bodies that you're involved in. Many thanks. So, and Carmen, how about you? Were you confronted with the same distrust or maybe these calls for partisanships, and how did you respond to it?
I think for us and for GeoHealth, I would say that quite the opposite was the case. So we have been experiencing quite a lot of, not sure about trust, but interest in our work and increasing attention for the need of spatiotemporal and geospatial considerations of disease-related questions, I would say. While in the past and pre-pandemic, for example, if someone would ask me what GeoHealth is and what it is needed for, I would need time to explain, and it would be difficult to convince someone that this is important and relevant. But now I feel that that scientists and policymakers, practitioners understand the relevance and even request the services, so to say, of GeoHealth more. For example, for using mapping and geospatial or spatial statistics to improve health-related planning and decision-making, for example, through the creation of dashboards with real-time information about high-risk areas related to COVID-19, for example, or high-risk populations. So I think for us, I don't know if I don't know about trust, but I think the interest really increased, and also requesting the work that we are doing to really help address this crisis. Yeah.
So it made your work more relatable for many people.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Also, this link between medicine and geography. Now it is very clear to people why it is important and that it is important to solve problems too. Yeah.
Well, thanks. That's a somewhat different response indeed, and Marie has given. And let's hear Christian, who of course has a very different environment and also different involvement from his expertise in his center in fighting the pandemic. So what did you in your environment learn about this distrust or suspicion against science, and how did you respond to it, Christian?
Well, I do think that in our own case, it was somehow misguided in the sense that the data that we generated a lot of interest. Many African governments actually saw the power behind the data that we were generating, and then how this data could be used in order to respond to the epidemic or to the pandemic on the continent. So that really created a lot of interest. And I mean, if you were looking, there's a surge of what I call genomic facilities in Africa, over this pandemic, and to support public health response. And that, in a way, that was very positive. But where where distrust was really, I would say, driven by social media. We created also the doubt in the minds of people about the information that one was generating. The relevance and the importance of vaccines, and even the virus that we're busy diagnosing. So I think it was, in some plan they were asking, does it really exist? Are you guys not just making this up to scare the world and then to support some venture capitalists to make more money? I think there is really, that was also there, whereby the science community had to face, and the people that were completely against science and then using social media. I think that was really one major challenge, and it's still been a major challenge where, distrust for science has been set up or sold in the mind of people, and it's really, I think it will take a huge effort and collective effort to overcome.
Mm. Right. Yeah. So I think what you just mentioned, how maybe social media or different environments in which this distrust and suspicion against science are raised. I recall Marie telling that we need to be more transparent, and whether that is a way that helps to overcome this suspicion, this distrust, being more transparent in a way, more explaining what we are doing than we did typically. Do you as panelists, do you feel that this greater transparency helps in that? And is it for you very challenging to be much more transparent as well? So who would like to respond?
I think it
I can go first.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think transparency is going to be very helpful. I think we need to say clearly exactly what we're doing, but I also think that definitely it's going to be helpful to convince some few people that are on the fence. But we're also going to realize that in this world, there are those that believe, those that are on the fence, and those that no matter what you do, they won't believe you, because they are completely, their mindset is just like, no, science is really not something that is serious. But I do think that as scientists, we will have to continue to generate evidence and generate data, to convince people. And I guess that's just the only thing that we have to do. There's a need for a lot of education, a lot of advocacy, but then let's, use data as much as possible to generate the evidence that can convince those, mainly those that are on the fence, because it's going to be very difficult, for people that are really, against science. No matter what you do, they will find a reason not to believe or to undermine whatever you say.
Yeah, of course, indeed. Yeah. So Marie, you wanted also to add to this conversation.
Yeah, just that indeed sharing data, I think is really important. So share everything in the whole process, that to increase the transparency of what you're doing. But there is an inherent tension in a way, because of course, if you ask me as a scientist, I'm always doubting on everything that I do. And when most of my analysis, even when I can see that it's a really solid design and the results are really solid, and I actually don't have doubt about there are of course always things that you can do better, so, and I experience that sometimes when policymakers would ask me, okay, so can I really trust that this is really, this is the truth, I want to hear from you as a scientist. This is how, and then of course, then I had to say, yes, you can trust me, because I know that this is solid. We did this really careful, and we are not overestimating our conclusions. We are, but it does require, that, because in some way, when you ask a scientist, do you doubt? Yeah, of course you doubt, because that's what you're supposed to do. And you know that there are different ways of studying the same things, and there, you know, but so in some way we have to be more firm, but that is, I think, just as scientists, a habitus that feels uncomfortable often, you know. So for people that are not aware of how science is working, this can come across as unreliable, but that in fact it's not. It's more reliable, you know. But
so I think there's some thanks a lot by putting forward this inherent tension. Maybe Carmen, can you relate to that? Because I think Christian also mentioned we need to educate. So do we as scientists maybe have to invest more of our time in educating a wider audience about what we are doing in normal times so they can trust more, including the tensions, the doubts that Marie just mentioned when we present data in times of crisis? How do you feel about that, Carmen?
No, I absolutely agree with the need for greater transparency. What we have been doing before the pandemic and what we've been trying to emphasize during the pandemic is really, and I mentioned that before, science communication. So we try to wrap in easy words and in short stories what we have been doing and why this is important, with links to the more complex readings, to the data, to portals where data can be used by whoever user may be wanting to use the data themselves. So really sharing, as Marie mentioned they are doing too, sharing every step of the process, including also ethical protocols, ethical clearances for research that was conducted, granting access to dashboards. So we're trying to do the same thing, but also, as I said, not only sharing data and information, but really sharing research findings and the process in an accessible and easy language online through blogs, etc. So that's what we're trying to do too.
Right. So this is a perhaps really a long-term effort also to educate also people how to use or to look at these data, etc.
Yeah. Also, I mean, we specifically try to reach all kinds of audiences, not only the scientists, not only the policymakers who may know about public health, not only practitioners who work at the front line of the pandemic, for example, but we want for the public to understand what we're doing.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think several colleagues also present here and that may look later online of the Faculty of Science are also involved in outreach, in educating pupils, wider audience. Anyone wants to respond to this conversation or to add? Anyone? So I think we are not just considering outreach as something to raise interest in pupils, for high school pupils for studying science, but also indeed to make people aware, what are we doing? How do we respond to questions in a wider community, etc.
Also, if I may add something, I think something that is very important in this regard is to, I'm currently not involved in one of those projects, but I think also citizen science in the context of COVID-19 is really increasing. So involving and making the public participate in collecting data so they can understand the process from the beginning to the end. And I think this is something that we could also, I mean, that should also be enforced, or not enforced, but well, improved or pushed forward after the pandemic as well, because I think it's really a nice way and tool to increase the trust in science and in scientific processes as well.
Right. So there will certainly be something, I think, that all of us need to be involved also beyond the crisis, because I guess what we now observe, that if you come to the table only during a crisis, it may be too late to really educate the wider audience, to get them involved in our efforts. So is there, if there's no one with a question about this, or Diletta? Yes, Diletta, maybe you can just open your mic and ask the question as well.
Yeah, I was not maybe connected to outreach that much, but more I was curious about the role of science in influencing policy decision, and how I don't know, how was the process, and if it was different, maybe there was more pressure, the timing was different in this specific crisis. So if the panel could elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, Christiane, I think you're very close to policymakers and government officials. Is there anything you can mention also on this interaction, if there's particular pressures on you as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think during the course of this pandemic, I think it is clear that science, in our own case, has helped policy making a whole lot. For instance, confirming the cases, providing the genomic data with temporal spread has really helped a lot in terms of, making the decisions in terms of lockdowns or opening borders, or also targeted lockdown in some areas. And if you notice in the case of Africa a whole lot, there were a lot of situations whereby you could see decisions being taken in a very coordinated manner. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Africa's really have done well for responding to this pandemic, because a lot of the decisions made on the continent in the background were informed by science, and they're spearheaded by the African CDC, for instance. And that really has helped, because you could see a really direct a connection between science and policy making. And then we also leverage what they did, by basically leverage infrastructure that were available to support countries that did not have infrastructure, generate the data, and then use the data to make policies. For instance, my lab was able to sequence samples from Somalia, for instance, all the way from Somalia to the Horn of Africa to West Africa. Sample shipped, data are generated, sent back to them, and then they use this information to make really informed decisions.
Right, so there's really a tight connection here. And Marie, I think you were also involved in policy making and maybe adjusting policies. How did you experience that connection?
Yeah, so I think we did two assignments that we got from one from the Municipality of Amsterdam and the other from the government, on the face mask, and the other one on the curfew. And these assignments were, we had to deliver the results really quick. So, and we could do that because we had set up this machinery of doing these kinds of studies over time. And then we knew, okay, so we can do this, we can set it up, and we can deliver results in a few weeks. And that was literally when we did the face mask. The Prime Minister literally said in one of his speeches, yeah, we're still waiting for the evaluation of this, and before we can decide on whether we're going to install the face mask, So that was the kind of pressure we were dealing with, and we were not getting the data quick enough, and there was a lot of stuff going on. But anyway, so when the results were there, we were asked to the table and said, and then they. Obviously, there were other factors playing a role for whether this was, the major anxiety around the face mask was whether people would keep less distance if they would wear a face mask. And we were able to show that that was not the case. So when that was done, then there was a decision made. So, that happened by, via the behavioral unit at the RIVM that brought in the results of our studies to the table of the OMT, and the OMT were then delivering their advice to the government. So it was quite a complicated, but the behavioral unit at the RIVM was very important, and they were supporting our studies all the time and wanting us to deliver the results. They were lobbying, in order to get impact, which so was quite difficult as a behavioral scientist. There's been a lot of critique of this, I think, that there hasn't been any social scientists, behavioral scientists at the table, really. And so, and the same with the curfew. So
thanks. I think what you're mentioning here, that the fact that the Prime Minister is on public TV, like almost pointing to you in your chair, like we're waiting for your results. That's an experience not many scientists are having. So congratulations, but I think it's a mixed bag here.
It was very mixed bag.
Yeah. And then Ardeen Peter van Tinderen wrote in the chat, so scientists are not making a lot of use in normal times of social media, these other channels where we may reach a wider audience. I think, Carmen, you mentioned doing some of this work. So how do you feel, should we indeed not in a way criticize these scientists. I'm thinking of many like physicists, but also like psychologists like Steven Pinker writing these millions of books, copies sold. And they were often a little bit criticized for doing pop science, but maybe are we thinking a bit different about those? So Carmen, what do you think? Should we do more of that indeed?
I would not want to comment on that one, but I think in general, it's important to put the word out. I think it's not necessarily doing more, but maybe doing it in a more targeted way and making sure that the audience that needs a certain type of information can have easy access to that. Maybe just to put it in simple terms. I don't think it's about producing as much as possible and swamping the public with it, because then it gets very difficult to find what is useful for a certain population or for a certain high-risk group or else. But I think more targeted is helpful. And that's why I think science and decision-making and communication need to be more integrated. Yeah, but I think it's not necessarily about quantity. It's really about targeted and quality. Yeah.
Right.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, Marie, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think it's also about taking responsibility as a scientist. And sometimes I felt throughout the pandemic that I had colleagues that had a lot of very relevant knowledge about particular aspects of the public debate that were not really engaging, because they were, I don't know why, but I also think that there is definitely, something to say about that we are in a pandemic, and we have a responsibility also to try to have an impact on the policies and the way we're surviving this together. And I felt that sometimes we could do that better, to not just stay at home and do our thing, but also, make use of the knowledge that we also have, to have an impact. So engage in public debate. Yeah.
And taking up responsibility. I think that's gives a nice entry to our next topic, which is really about this responsibility that we as individual scientists might have in this context. So I'm again pulling up my slide very briefly to introduce like a brief presentation. A quick disclosure here, Sarai Keista is indeed my daughter, but she's also a colleague PhD candidate at the Amsterdam Medical Center. She's been working at the Oxford University in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine on different diseases, also in several regions in Africa. But the reason that I've invited her to briefly present on the COVID-19 vaccine development is because she's been a coordinator of the UK until quite recently for a student pressure group, lobby group called Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. And she took initiative for several studies that have made it all the way to recent EU and WHO reports, because it shows that actually the story of vaccine development is somewhat different than many think, and that it may help us to get some lessons on how we should provide our knowledge to a wider audience, to other maybe collaborations in the Global South. So Sarai, can I give you the floor? And I'm quite proud to do so. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'm from an organization called Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. And what we really are all about is that we try to attract interest to the fact that a third to a quarter of all new medicines and health technologies originate from a university lab. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really not enough emphasized that early biomedical research, especially in highly risky but not very profitable areas of health research, such as vaccine technologies, often takes place at publicly funded research institutions. And what I really want to talk about now is what our responsibility is in ensuring that the fruits of science are then equitably shared, and how far we as a university community also should hold our institutions responsible in this process in terms of what kind of things we research, but also on how we then commercialize these health technologies. So in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I just quickly wanted to highlight that we still face a severe inequality in the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, which remains one of the greatest failures of international cooperation during the global coronavirus outbreak. So the United Nations Secretary General told world leaders that vaccine inequity is actually an obscenity and that we did pass the science test, but we're getting an F in ethics. Indeed, Médecins Sans Frontières have estimated that if available vaccine doses were to be steadily redistributed, nearly 1 million deaths could be averted by mid-2022 compared to current scenarios, and a worldwide rollout of suitable vaccine would save the global economy $13 million for every day the pandemic is shortened. However, what we see in reality very clearly on this map is that although a lot of high-income countries have vaccinated more than 70% of their population, and many people have even received a third or even a fourth vaccine dose, actually in low and middle income countries, only about 5% of the population has been able to get vaccinated, which is because high and upper middle income countries have received approximately 80% of the vaccines produced. Some of the really important questions and bottlenecks that we should look at within the COVID-19 pandemic is who is funding the research that led to the COVID-19 vaccines, and who controls the intellectual property rights of the health technologies that come out of it, and on what terms is this knowledge shared. Furthermore, we should really discuss who's profiting from the status quo and what responsibility we as researchers have to challenge the current structural inequalities. Indeed, we should ask as a university community how we can ensure that public return on public investment takes place in the form of global equitable access to these scientific innovations. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the research that myself and some of my colleagues, which are all early career researchers and students from across the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, have been doing on the ChAdOx vaccine technology, which underlies the AstraZeneca vaccine that has been used in 178 countries and was one of the first COVID vaccines that came to market. So this vaccine relies on nearly 2 decades of research at the University of Oxford and has an important application to other diseases of global health interest. And what we really wanted to do is, using freedom of information requests, increase the transparency of the research funding, and also to find out more about how Oxford commercialized this health technology and if they ensured global equitable access in this process. So we found that the ChAdOx research and development is very largely publicly funded, and that both UK government funding, but also from overseas government, as well as from charities, played the major role before the start of the pandemic in developing this vaccine technology. Indeed, it was already undergoing clinical trials at the point where exclusive license was given to AstraZeneca to further develop this technology. This despite earlier commitments by the university to hand out non-exclusive licenses and ensure really equitable pricing for the duration of the pandemic and beyond in low and middle income countries. When we tried to get access to the documents that document this transfer of the rights to further develop this technology from the University of Oxford to AstraZeneca, we found that there's really a lack of transparency here as well, where major parts of the vaccine contract are redacted for commercial interest. So there is no accountability then from the university over this publicly financed research. So in the end, what we find is that public funding is really important in vaccine development, which provides an important argument against the idea that vaccines need to be priced very expensively because R&D investment needs to be recouped for private vaccine manufacturers, if indeed the most risky research is done at publicly funded institutions. And this really sparked a debate about the terms and conditions through which publicly financed research
and science is shared and commercialized later on, and how we can ensure global equitable access downstream. So the next question for discussion is, what responsibility do we as scientists have to foster equity, diversity, and inclusivity in our responses to the pandemic? And I'd specifically like to ask your comments on how we can ensure global equitable access to our health innovations and what responsibility we have in ensuring this process. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Sarai, for the very clear statement. So this question on our individual and collective responsibility as scientists to share our innovations for equitable access, I'd like to hear your responses about. So maybe, Carmen, can we hear you first in response to this question?
I think when you sent me the question in advance, I had a very different, I misunderstood. I understood that you were wondering how to foster equity, diversity, inclusion in terms in general, responding to the pandemic. So maybe we can listen to the other responses first, and then I can go with my last, because mine is a little bit unrelated.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Sorry for the confusion. So maybe Marie, are you willing to respond, able to respond to this?
Well, yeah, the way I looked at it was more from my field, but I think what Sarai was telling is incredibly interesting and important, and I would definitely communicate this message, share it with a journalist or someone that could write about this, you know, because this is, I think the knowledge that you shared is something that a lot of people are not aware of, and this idea that it's indeed for, you know, the commercial interests of the companies involved in the development of the vaccine, but not all the public funding related. You know, that those are things that I didn't know about before you telling me now. So I think there's an audience out there that should know about this. Yeah. But
how about your work or the decisions that you've made along the way? So did these issues around diversity and inclusion also matter to you when you made particular choices in methods, maybe in a kind of advice, or do you feel that you have a specific responsibility also from the position that you have during this pandemic? Yeah, I think so. I think that too. Well, I think in general there's been too little attention to it, to say that first. I think within academia, there has been an incredibly inequality in you know, working conditions. So just looking at our own community, I think we could have done much more to address this question. But I think in general, well, with my own, I sometimes get questions about, you know, my opinion about the 3G and you know, those kinds of new divisions that we see now, of people that are vaccinated, people that are not vaccinated. And so you see a lot of fraction, of course, and a lot of potential division in opinions about how we're supposed to deal with this. And I think from my own field, well, we know, you know, how people respond to crises in general. There's a lot of knowledge about that, and we know that any form of you know, constructing us and them, groups of us and them, you know, is a very bad idea. So we know that that's only creating less compliance and more risk of conflict, you know, in the long term. So I think that, yeah, so that's something where I think that I and maybe my group and other scientists could have played a bigger role in opening their mouth when these initiatives were discussed, you know, politically. Yeah. Right. I think that's a great example. So from a social scientist perspective, like this creation of in and out groups, warning maybe governments about this and maybe taking responsibility in pointing that out. That's a great example. Yeah. Christian, how about you? Of course, I think it's a very different situation for you. However, taking responsibility as a scientist, I think what you sketched us was really doing 2 years nothing but this. But how do you feel that this focus on diversity and inclusion should inform us as scientists also in normal times?
Yeah, but I think it's important to, I mean, diversity and inclusion is really important because if you don't have that, then you tend not to understand what is happening, I mean, on the other side of where you are. I guess the broader coalition we do have, then the better, because at least we should be able to have a deep dive and a deep understanding of what is going on, and then make policies, or make decisions that really would account for every other person, maximum, the largest number of people's opinion. And I do think that, we should try as much as possible to promote that, so that, at the end of the day, when you really making decisions, people feel that, okay, their views and opinions and things were taken into account. And then you tend to see a lot of compliance. I think it's always very nice to hear from others that really do not disagree with you. They may have genuine reasons, and that we should also be guided by those opinions. I mean, our responses or our decisions should also take those into account.
Right. So so the sound wasn't optimal, but if I hear you correctly here, what you mentioned is we have to have these broader coalitions already in place, and then treating also with respect those with maybe different opinions as a way to include them really from the get-go into these endeavors. So that again brings us also, I think, and the fourth question, the next question is about that. So what should we keep on doing maybe in normal times? I think this broader coalition is an important lesson here, perhaps. So thanks. So Carmen, being somewhat like put on the spot by now, maybe hearing others. So what do you feel about this responsibility as scientists?
Yeah, so actually the way I had understood the question, and maybe it's still relevant, so I still want to bring this up, was about responding to the pandemic and fostering equity, diversity, and inclusion. There was a specific example I wanted to bring up. So as I mentioned before, what we do with GeoHealth is a useful tool in analyzing and responding to disease outbreaks in general, and to closing health service delivery gap, for example. And an example related to equity, diversity, and inclusion that I had wanted to bring up, which is not related to vaccines, but which I'm still bringing up, was about a project that we were supposed to implement before and during the pandemic in a country of the global south, which resulted in failure, unfortunately. So we were planning on a collaborative teaching project to communicate and teach some of those tools that we are using to respond to the pandemic. So in this university and in this country, people can use them themselves as well. And the funding had already been safeguarded, and everything everything was ready to get started, but we could not implement it. Why not? Although partners, funders acknowledged the importance of this project, the challenge was that because educational settings were closed, we could not execute the project because in the country we were supposed to work, the internet connectivity was not sufficient to implement this project. So I think, again, it's not directly related to this point, but I think it's important as well that we should bear in mind that while in the Netherlands and other high-income countries in Europe and beyond, we're so concerned with, we ourselves are only concerned with having a quiet space at home where we can work peacefully. But in other countries, people may not have this opportunity altogether. And I think here inequalities in participation are very profound as well, and more efforts need to be made to remove such barriers. And I think this also relates to technologies and many other things. So again, not exactly the point that was supposed to be made here, but I find it very important to be added as well, that this luxury of having access to information is not possible to everybody. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think it is relevant because it's about sharing resources more than like beyond scientific results, and maybe of how can we enable collaborators or audience members from the global south to really be involved. And it might, I know from colleagues from Science Park, for instance, who for a certain project shipped like older computers to community members in the Global South for interaction. So there may be ways to do this, but at least considering it is one step, perhaps.
But then I think even the connectivity and internet access, or electricity even to start with, is still a problem. So we would have done this online and remotely, but we couldn't because it was impossible. So I think trying to remove such barriers is maybe not necessarily the job only of science, but more of infrastructure policymakers, ministries of infrastructure, international organizations, etc. But I think it's something to keep in mind as well.
Right, and maybe to lobby for, as Sarai's presentation also made clear. If we can't influence it directly, then maybe indirectly.
Absolutely.
So is there anyone wanting to add to this conversation or raise a question for the panelists? Because gradually I think I want to then maybe go to our final question. Let me put on the slide again. And the final question is indeed like returning to normal times. We don't know really what normal times will imply, whether it means like keeping distance or being vaccinated regularly. But my question to the panelists and also to the audience members is like, what element of science in normal times do you think we should change? Also with regard to teaching the next generation of scientists. We are, of course, not doing science, not doing research, but we're also teaching. So what should we maybe teach them about science in normal times? So maybe if you can share like a main lesson about this, and then I'd really be curious to hear responses also from audience members, whether they feel it resonates with them or their actual work as scientists and researchers. So maybe Christian, can you respond to this first?
Yeah, I think going back to normal time, what we've heard, we've learned about, during this pandemic is really, more than the power for information. I think what we've learned, from this pandemic is that information, we used to know that knowledge and information is power, but I think it's resonant now more than ever. And I do think that, getting back to normal time, we should try to be consistent about sharing data and then making data accessible, because, there's just so much power behind it. But I also do think that, we should try as much as possible going back to normal time to reduce what I call the gap and the divide that is existing, in the globe, and so that at least we can get back to a world that is a bit more what I would call equitable, because regardless where we are, science, now there is that great understanding that science done anywhere and done well has a lot of power and that can help the globe generally. And we should try to reduce those inequities by, as some of our colleagues mentioned, by making sure that we have infrastructures, because it's one thing to fund science, but
I think you're muted.
In the developing world.
Okay, no, you were very briefly muted. So maybe your last sentence. Your last sentence.
Yeah, I was saying it was something to fund. To fund research and science, but it's also another actually to ensure that infrastructures are in place actually to support good science. I would think that if you go back to the good normal, we should strive as a global community to ensure that we have strong infrastructure all across the globe, and especially in the places that are more vulnerable and that have the potential for emergence of pathogens that will have pandemics, to have a safer world.
Mm-hmm. Right, I think that resonates with what Carmen just also mentioned, that maybe that in times of normalcy, we should ensure that this sharing, as you mentioned, is possible at all, that the preconditions are in place there. So maybe, Carmen, you want to follow up on that and maybe add something that you think we should be doing in normal times?
Certainly the same points. So what is in my mind is really contingency planning for flexibility and making improvisation a bit easier. Moving online, improving collaborations. As I mentioned before, science communication, trying to remove paywalls where possible. Mm-hmm. Sharing data using what already exists more, not reinventing the wheel. Of course, for a pandemic, that's not possible. But for example, one research project that we're currently involved in is what can we learn from the pandemic to address the consequences that we will be facing from effects accompanying climate change. So trying to already observe what is happening, what we can use as lessons learned in the future. So trying to use information that we are collecting now, that we have collected in the past, and integrate it with new data. Yeah, maybe these are the main points I want to make.
That are interesting challenges. I'm sure if the pandemic ever settles down, it doesn't really mean that time of rest will be there for you and your colleagues. And Maria, how about you, returning to normal?
Yeah, I think I already said it a bit at the beginning that I really missed a kind of baseline overview, insights in ordinary behavior, so in many ways I think being inspired by what you see in infectious disease, that there's also in times of no pandemic, you know exactly what's going on. You have a whole monitor system of what kind of diseases are happening where, what you described, Carmen, from your studies as well. Well, in some way I'm inspired. I think we need that for social behavior as well, so much more of a general overview of what's going on, but that's more the content. I think personally what I really took from this pandemic was that I think the fact that we have been working in a group with my different collaborators, the group dynamics that we have had have been incredibly efficient in producing results, because we have a kind of structure for how we're working, a very well-defined responsibility. So when something is happening, we just take on the task and then we just carry it out and then we deliver results, and in some way it sounds really basic, but in my field, it's quite uncommon to work in a group. So most social scientists have their own small Togo that they work in. And I could see that compared to some of my colleagues, they would have to spend a lot of time discussing what is a riot or what is compliance. We could spend a lot of, and in some way in a pandemic, you need to be quicker. You can't go that basic all the time. You sometimes have, and that is possible if you are in a group setting, because then you can divide tasks. And then you don't have to carry it all on your own. So I think for me, a lesson for hopefully after the pandemic, that I really want to continue working in a group, because I think that is for everyone much better. And then I think the collaboration with the practitioners, that's also really a lesson. And not only that we deliver results, because I could also see a different loop in the sense that I got a lot of very relevant questions from the practitioners that inspired me to do different research. So we should stop thinking about practitioners and societal relevance as something we have to do additional to our studies. It should be much more at the front, because they can help us become better scientists and start asking questions that we would otherwise not have been thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So I think a common theme in your responses is really about collaborations and interactions within your field, with other fields, even with practitioners or citizens. Being myself invested in inter and transdisciplinary research that really speaks to me, so involving extra academic stakeholders, also for ensuring like the social robustness of our advice. I mean, it doesn't make sense to offer advice if citizens will not comply with it. So taking them on board and designing new methods, etc., with them is really a way to go. But it's really interesting how you describe, all three of you, how in a way the social field in which you are operating has changed a lot, and how you would like to maintain that or even increase that. So maybe again, invitation to those in the audience, and there are only a few right now here in real time. But if you want to respond or raise a question, please do so. Maybe I'd like to, as a final statement, ask you, since we're not just researchers, but also educators. So maybe a final message to our students, your students, our students. So what would you tell them? how science might look different for them post-pandemic. They don't know perhaps the normal times, but what exciting future do you see for a new generation of scientists being trained right now by us? So Christian, is that something you'd like to start with?
Yeah, I do think that the future is really exciting for the new generation of students. I encourage them to be as collaborative as possible, because I guess it's through collaboration that we will break barriers. It is through collaboration that we will actually breaking down the silos, that we will actually get to the new frontiers of science and then make the necessary discoveries that are very important and very impactful, you know, for humanities. And it is clear now that working in silos and then looking at science as a science will not be helpful. I think scientists will have to interact with social scientists and people in art and in other disciplines. So, and I think it's going forward, our students should be thinking about being more collaborative and then interact with other fields that are completely outside their own areas of specialties.
Oh, that's a nice addition. Even mentioning art here as maybe something that connects or allows us to bridge to very different communities. Thanks a lot. Carmen, how about you as an educator for the next generation? What is your message?
Similar, I would say. So just looking at this panel, Marie, Christian, and I, as well as Sarai, we all come from different disciplines. We are all, in a way, looking at or collaborating with different stakeholders with policy and practice, but we all face similar challenges and have different needs. So I think what I would tell scientists of the future, or I would say, open your minds and reach out to colleagues from other disciplines and also to people beyond research in order to comprehend and really understand what the problem that you may be interested in researching or solving is all about and how to actually contribute to its solution. I think this is really what we all have in common here and what is most important. Yeah. Don't stay in your own as a silo, and disciplinary bubble, because else you will not be able to comprehend what the challenge that you want to look at and solve is really about.
Thanks. Marie.
I think I can just add, you know, to believe that that they have a role to play. You know, I think Sarai's talk was also very inspiring, you know, that early career scholars can make a huge difference, and they see things and you know that are incredibly important that they bring to the table and make the connection with practitioners, that the things that they are dealing with in their lives matters for, and it's something they can go and do research on and play a role in. And then I think in rethinking teaching, and now we're sitting here in this online debate, and we all know that there are a lot of advantages but also disadvantages. And I think what I see from university boards is that they tend to focus mainly on the advantages, because it's also a way of making teaching more lean and saving resources in a lot of ways, which is positive, of course, when we think about flying less and that we can engage with colleagues internationally. But there are also problems related with this kind of communication. So, and I think the younger generations really have to claim to make their voice heard in this as well.
Well, thanks for those reflections. I think what you mentioned, Marie, about early career researchers being important. And I think what you all mentioned, in a way, the flexibility, the fact that we have new collaborations, new platforms of data sharing, etc. It also points to a future in which it may be somewhat easier as well as an early career researcher, for instance, to contribute, because as I think at the start of the panel, we also discovered, as I think Marie, you mentioned, like the traditional peer review process, which takes a long time, have these heavy editorial review boards, etc. These tend to be discouraging to early career researchers. And in a way, what we've seen in the recent past, it may make it also easier for others to contribute to this knowledge, the development of new knowledge, the dissemination, etc. So I think with that, let me briefly see, Sarah, you've been mentioned a couple of times. Do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the last thing about the early career research thing, because I think it's really hard if you're a student and you feel like you want to do something different or see what is happening in something like a pandemic or times of crisis, and you really want to respond to that in a new perspective. It's sometimes really hard to get to that point. However, I experienced is that if you're trained well in scientific methods and you get the opportunity and the freedom to do so, then actually in some sense, the way that we organize science where you have anonymous peer review can also be very advantageous, because at that point, you're not judged anymore based on, oh, you're just a student, oh, you just started, but it's really based on the content and the quality of your ideas. So I think in that sense, some of these parts we might want to also keep, because it is much easier if it's anonymous to just be judged based on your ideas rather than the person. So yeah, that was just something that I wanted to add here.
Yeah, thanks. It points out that we shouldn't like throw overboard all our traditional practices, keep some of them really at bay, but at the same time see how we can innovate with the lessons that we've learned in the past 2 years. I think by now we've almost completed our 2 hours of discussions, of conversations. I'm very grateful to our panelists for being involved in that, for spending their time with us, and knowing that all of you are really extremely busy, specifically because of the pandemic. Let me, in closing, very briefly point out to those, but I don't think many of us will have the time to join the program later. I wanted to share this also for later reference when it's being put online, that people can find us by email, and also the diversity landing page of the Faculty of Science website. And I think with that, I want to thank our panelists for their contributions, their thoughts, and I'm quite sure that we'll use that for further reference also in teaching in the Faculty of Science and maybe elsewhere. So many thanks for your contributions. I will stop the recording right now with my thanks, so we can have a